There's a pattern in history that has destroyed global superpowers, not with bombs, but with paperwork, not on battlefields, but at negotiating tables. And right now, in 2024, 2025, today, you are living inside that exact pattern. In 1945, Britain won World War II. Its flag still flew across continents. Its navy still ruled the seas. Its people believed victory meant security. And yet, just 1 year later, Britain signed a deal that quietly ended its empire. No surrender ceremony, no headlines, just debt. $3.75 billion, a loan to survive the peace. That moment didn't just change Britain, it changed the world. Because from that deal came a system, one built on credit, leverage, and rules written by those who lend, not those who borrow. A system that looks stable, sounds rational, feels unavoidable, and slowly transfers power from nations to balance sheets. This isn't a conspiracy. It's documented history, treaties, loan agreements, institutions, incentives. And here's the uncomfortable part. The same structure that absorbed the British Empire is still running your life today. Your mortgage, your credit score, your savings, your country's debt, different names, same mechanics. 3 empires made this mistake. Each believed they were the exception. Each paid the price. By the end of this video, you'll see exactly where that pattern began and where you now stand inside it. Because this story isn't about the past. It's about the system you woke up in this morning. Every empire tells itself the same story right before the decline begins. This time is different. They say their technology is better, their institutions are stronger, their people are smarter, and every time they are wrong. To understand what happened to Britain and why it matters to you, you have to pull back far enough to see the full map. Not years, not decades, centuries. Because empires don't fall randomly. They fall in patterns, predictable ones. In the 16th century, Spain sat at the center of the world. It controlled the flow of gold and silver from the Americas. Its navy dominated trade routes. Its currency was trusted across Europe. Spain believed it had cracked the code of permanent power. But the gold created laziness. Debt replaced productivity. Wars were financed with borrowing instead of output. By the late 1600s, Spain was bankrupt, on paper and in reality. 2 centuries later, Britain stepped into that vacuum. By the early 1900s, Britain ruled the largest empire in human history. The sun never set on its territory. Global trade moved through London. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. British leaders believed they were different from Spain, more disciplined, more rational, more modern. Then came 2 world wars. Britain didn't lose because it was defeated militarily. It lost because it financed survival with debt. Enormous debt. Debt that required structural change. Debt that shifted leverage. Debt that quietly moved the center of gravity across the Atlantic. And then there was the Soviet Union. In 1991, it looked invincible from the outside. Nuclear weapons, global reach, ideological certainty. But internally, the system had stopped producing real value. It borrowed credibility from force instead of earning it through productivity. When trust collapsed, the empire disappeared in less than 2 years. Not through invasion, but through implosion. Different cultures, different ideologies, same ending. This is the pattern most people miss. Empires don't fall when they're weak. They fall when they're powerful, but leveraged. When they believe the system they built will protect them forever. And every time, there's a moment when the ruling class says the same thing. We have no choice. No choice but to borrow. No choice but to restructure. No choice but to accept new rules written by someone else. That's the moment Britain reached in 1946. And here's why this matters to you. Because the pattern doesn't only apply to empires. It applies to households, to cities, to entire generations. You see it when families finance lifestyles with credit instead of income. When cities promise pensions they can't pay. When countries roll debt forever, assuming growth will cover the gap. At every level, the logic sounds reasonable in the moment, necessary even. But zoomed out, it always leads to the same destination: loss of control. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history repeating itself with new labels. And in the next part, we're going to slow this pattern down even further. We're going to take one empire, Britain, and walk through the exact sequence that turned a victorious nation into a debtor state. Because once you see how cleanly it happened to them, you'll start recognizing a softer, quieter version of the same mechanics operating in your own life right now. Britain didn't lose its empire in a single dramatic moment. It lost it quietly, on paper, over time, one payment after another. In 1945, Britain emerged from World War II on the winning side, but economically shattered. Its cities were damaged. Its industry was exhausted. Its people were facing food shortages so severe that rationing continued years after the war ended. Victory had kept the nation alive. It had not made it solvent. By 1946, Britain faced a simple reality. Without outside help, it could not feed its own population. So, it turned to the only country that could lend at that scale, the United States. The loan was framed as friendly assistance. $3.75 billion offered to stabilize Britain and rebuild Europe. But the money came with conditions. Conditions that didn't look dangerous at first. Conditions that sounded reasonable, technical even. Britain had to dismantle its imperial trade preferences. It had to open its markets. It had to make its currency convertible. Each requirement seemed small. Each felt temporary. Together, they dismantled the economic skeleton of the British Empire. This is the part most history books rush past. Before Britain even received the full loan, it had already sold off massive overseas assets, railways, utilities, investments, often at fire sale prices to American buyers. Gold reserves flowed out. Strategic naval bases were handed over. The closed trading system that once tied the empire together was opened permanently, and then came the repayment. Britain didn't pay back that loan in a decade, or two. It paid for 60 years. The final installment was made in 2006, long after the empire was gone, long after the pound had lost reserve status, long after Britain had accepted a junior role in a new global order. Think about that. An empire that ruled the world for centuries spent 6 decades sending checks to survive one war it technically won. This wasn't incompetence. It wasn't betrayal. It was leverage. Britain didn't collapse because it made irrational choices. It collapsed because, in the moment of crisis, debt was the only option left. And debt always comes with ownership embedded inside it, just not in a way that looks like conquest. Zoom in on the human side. Imagine a dock worker in Liverpool in the early 1950s. Trade routes shrinking, jobs disappearing, prices rising. He's told this is just a temporary adjustment, that Britain is modernizing, that the pain is necessary. But the work never comes back, not because he failed, but because the system around him changed permanently. This is the key lesson. Empires don't fall when the loan is signed. They fall when the structure behind the loan reshapes everything beneath it. If this story feels uncomfortably familiar, it should, because you've seen a smaller version of it before, maybe in your city, your industry, or even your own household, borrowing to survive, selling assets to stay afloat, promising yourself it's just temporary. But Britain wasn't the end of the story. What happened to it became a model, a repeatable system, one that would soon be exported far beyond London. And that's where the pattern turns global. What happened to Britain wasn't a historical accident. It was a successful experiment. And once an experiment works at the scale of an empire, it doesn't stay local. It becomes policy. In July 1944, before the war had even ended, representatives from 44 countries met in a quiet town in New Hampshire, Bretton Woods. Officially, the goal was stability. Prevent another Great Depression. Avoid currency wars, rebuild a shattered world. That was the language. But underneath, a new global operating system was being installed. The United States emerged from the war with something no other nation had: intact industry, enormous gold reserves, and the ability to lend when everyone else needed to borrow. That asymmetry mattered more than tanks or soldiers, because from that moment on, influence would flow through credit, not conquest. Out of Bretton Woods came the IMF and the World Bank, institutions designed to help countries in crisis. But help came with structure, and structure came with conditions. If a country faced collapse, the process looked almost identical every time. First, a crisis, war, commodity shock, currency collapse. Then, emergency lending, presented as rescue. Then, conditions, reforms, austerity, privatization, market liberalization. Each step sounded responsible, necessary, temporary. But the outcome was always permanent. Local industries were open to foreign capital, state assets were sold. Domestic policy became constrained by external approval. Countries technically remained sovereign, but economically, they were now managed. This wasn't done with malice. That's what makes it effective. The officials involved believed they were stabilizing the world. Bankers believed they were reducing risk. Politicians believed there was no alternative. And at every step, the paperwork looked clean. This isn't conspiracy. This is institutional design. Zoom in on one example. A developing country in the 1970s borrows to industrialize. Global interest rates rise. Debt becomes unpayable. The IMF steps in. Loans are extended, but only if subsidies are cut, currencies devalued, and public assets sold. Foreign corporations enter. Local producers collapse. The country recovers on paper, but never regains control of its own economic destiny. And here's the quiet part. No one says out loud. Once a country enters this system, it rarely exits. Debt gets rolled, conditions get normalized, dependency becomes invisible. This is the same pattern Britain experienced, just scaled and standardized. They didn't need to conquer territories anymore. They didn't need flags or governors. The system did the work. And once this blueprint proved reliable abroad, it didn't stay overseas, because systems don't care about borders. They care about incentives. The same logic, credit as control, debt as discipline, would eventually be turned inward, towards cities, industries, households. But before we bring it home, we need to do one more thing. We need to name the pattern clearly, strip it down to its moving parts, turn history into a framework you can recognize anywhere, no matter the country, no matter the decade. Because once you can see the structure, you stop arguing about opinions. You start identifying stages. Here's the moment where everything snaps into focus. Because once you strip away the flags, the speeches, and the ideology, what's left is a repeatable structure. Different countries, different decades, same machine. This is the pattern that keeps showing up. Not as chaos, but as order. Not as failure, but as management. You can call it a collapse if you want. But collapse sounds accidental. This isn't accidental. There are 6 phases, every time. Phase 1, crisis. It always begins with a shock. War, energy shortages, currency instability, a financial crash. Something real breaks, people panic. Leaders say the same thing. This is an emergency. And they're right, the crisis is real, but crises do something important. They lower resistance. Phase 2, emergency lending. Money arrives fast. Loans framed as rescue, lifelines, stabilization. The terms sound technical, temporary, invisible to ordinary people. This is where most citizens breathe a sigh of relief. The worst feels over. It isn't. Phase 3, conditions. This is the first lock. The money comes with rules, budget cuts, market reforms, asset sales, efficiency. These aren't presented as ideology, only as necessity. Leaders say they have no choice, and at this point, they're usually telling the truth. Phase 4, asset transfer. This is the point of no return. Public wealth moves into private hands. Infrastructure, housing, utilities, natural resources. Things built over generations are sold in years. On balance sheets, this looks like recovery. On the ground, it looks like disappearance. Phase 5, dependency. The system stabilizes, but only in one direction. Debt gets rolled, new loans pay old ones, growth serves repayment, policy becomes constrained, independence becomes theoretical. This is where the system stops feeling temporary and starts feeling normal. Phase 6, normalization. This is the quietest phase and the most dangerous. A new generation grows up thinking this is just how things work. High debt, permanent pressure, shrinking margins, no alternatives, they blame themselves. Not the structure. Here's the key insight most people miss. The collapse doesn't happen at phase 6. The collapse happened back at phase 3, but it only becomes visible later. This is why arguments about politics miss the point. This is why blaming leaders misses the point. This is why Waiting for things to go back to normal never works, because this is the system working exactly as designed. Now, pause for a second and ask yourself something uncomfortable. Which of these phases feels like the world you're living in right now? Which ones feel familiar, not from history books, but from your own life? Hold that thought, because in the next part, we're going to take this framework and place it directly on the present, on the United States, on the dollar, on credit, housing, and the cost of simply staying afloat. And once we do that, the timeline stops feeling abstract. Here's the moment most people instinctively resist, because once you map the pattern onto the present, it stops being history and starts being personal. So, let's do it carefully, calmly, fact by fact. Take the 6 phases you just saw and lay them over the United States in 2024, 2025, right now. Phase 1, crisis. The crisis didn't arrive as a single explosion. It arrived in layers. The 2008 financial collapse, the pandemic shock, supply chain breakdowns, energy spikes, housing shortages. Different headlines. Same effect. Instability that never fully resolves. Phase 2, emergency lending. After each shock, the response was identical. Liquidity, stimulus, credit expansion, trillions created, deployed, normalized. Not because anyone wanted to be reckless, but because the alternative felt worse. And at first, it worked. Markets stabilized. Panic faded. People believed the danger had passed, but the money didn't disappear. It embedded itself into the system. Phase 3, conditions. This is where things quietly tighten. Higher interest rates, stricter credit standards, less margin for error. You feel it when your mortgage resets, when your credit score suddenly matters more than your work history, when borrowing costs rise faster than wages. This is the first lock, and most people don't realize they've entered it. Phase 4, asset transfer. Look around, home ownership drifting out of reach. Institutional buyers dominating housing markets. Rent rising faster than income. Public services quietly privatized. On paper, assets are still there. In reality, control is shifting. This isn't a crash, it's a reallocation. Phase 5, dependency. Now the system stabilizes, but only if you stay inside it. You need credit to live normally. You need debt to move forward. You need approval to participate. Opting out isn't illegal, it's just economically impossible. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Once a system reaches this phase, it doesn't reverse without disruption. It only rolls forward. Phase 6, normalization. This is where we are dangerously close. A generation growing up believing constant financial stress is normal, that working harder but falling behind is expected, that struggling is a personal failure, not a systemic phase. And that's the final lock. Because when pressure feels normal, people stop asking structural questions. Let's be clear about something. This doesn't mean collapse is tomorrow. It doesn't mean panic is justified. It doesn't mean anyone planned your hardship. It means the incentives are aligned in one direction, and you are downstream from them. They don't need you to fail. They just need you to keep paying. That's why the system feels stable and exhausting at the same time. This isn't a bug. This is the system working exactly as designed. But there's one piece we haven't examined yet. Because systems don't build themselves, they have architects, beneficiaries, decision makers who gain regardless of outcome. And until you understand who benefits when everything tightens, you can't fully see the trap. Here's the question that almost never gets asked out loud, because the moment you ask it, the entire story shifts. If this system is so stressful for so many people, why does it keep expanding? Systems don't persist by accident. They persist because they work for someone, not for you, not for most households, but for a very specific group that benefits whether the economy is booming or breaking. And this is where many people get uncomfortable. So, let's be precise. This is not about secret meetings or shadowy villains. This is not conspiracy. This is about incentives. Start with the most basic layer. There are institutions whose revenue increases when money moves faster, not when people live better. Banks earn fees when you borrow. Rating agencies earn money every time you're evaluated. Financial intermediaries get paid when assets are bought, sold, refinanced, or restructured, especially during stress. They don't need you to fail. They profit when you're uncertain. Then there are corporations large enough to survive volatility and small enough to exploit it. When interest rates rise, small businesses struggle. Large firms with access to cheap capital expand. When housing tightens, families hesitate. Institutional buyers step in. Same market, different rules. And then there's the quiet layer most people never notice. You cannot opt out. You don't choose to have a credit profile. You don't vote on interest rates. You don't negotiate the terms of participation. Your entire economic identity gets compressed into numbers, scores, ratios, risk profiles, managed by entities you never meet, operating under regulations you didn't write. And here's the most important part. When they're wrong, they don't absorb the consequences. When models fail, they get bailed out. When assumptions break, the cost is socialized. But when you miss a payment, your life tightens. Higher rates, lower access, fewer options. This is the structural asymmetry at the heart of the system. They design the rules, they collect the fees, they externalize the risk. You live inside the outcome. This isn't because they're evil. It's because the system rewards behavior that extracts stability upward and pushes volatility downward. And once that architecture is in place, it no longer requires intent. It runs on autopilot. That's why every crisis looks like an opportunity to someone else. That's why consolidation accelerates during downturns. That's why inequality widens even when productivity rises. They profit either way. You bear all the risk. And that realization matters because it changes how you interpret your own struggles. If the pressure you feel were purely personal, effort alone would fix it. But if the pressure is structural, then shame is misplaced and awareness becomes essential. Which brings us to the most important shift in this entire story. Because once you see who benefits, the question stops being, what's wrong with me? And becomes, how does this system show up in my everyday life? In the next part, we're bringing everything down from empires and institutions to groceries, rent, healthcare, retirement, and the quiet anxiety you carry with you every month. Empires don't collapse with fireworks. They collapse quietly, in grocery aisles, rent notices, and medical bills. That's why most people never recognize what they're living through. There's no single moment that screams history, just a long sequence of ordinary pressures that slowly tighten. Let's bring the pattern all the way down, from institutions to your kitchen table. Start with food. You notice prices rising, but not in dramatic spikes. Instead, it's shrinkage. Smaller packages, lower quality, fewer options. You're told it's supply chains, inflation, weather. And all of that is true. But the deeper pattern is this. When systems are leveraged, basic necessities become profit stabilizers. Demand is inelastic. You can't opt out of eating. So, pressure flows here first. Then there's housing. Buying a home now requires not just income, but perfect timing, perfect credit, and long-term debt acceptance. Renting offers no relief. Payments rise faster than wages. Ownership drifts further away. This isn't coincidence. Housing has shifted from shelter to asset class. And when shelter becomes collateral, families compete with balance sheets. Healthcare follows the same logic. You're insured, but still anxious. Covered, but never certain. One diagnosis can undo years of careful planning. This is what Phase 5 feels like on the body. Security that exists on paper, and vulnerability that exists in real life. Now, look at retirement. You're told to invest, to trust the markets, to plan decades ahead in a system that barely plans 5 years out. Risk is transferred downward, volatility upward. If things go well, you're responsible. If things go wrong, you're told it was always uncertain. And underneath all of this is credit, not as a tool, but as a gatekeeper. Your ability to move, work, borrow, or recover is filtered through a score you don't control, calculated by models you never see, enforced automatically. One mistake lingers for years. One emergency reshapes your future. This is how empires decline in lived experience. Not with collapse, but with compression. Less margin, more anxiety, constant self-blame. People assume they're failing individually, when in reality they're responding rationally to systemic pressure, working harder, saving more carefully, still falling behind. And that's the final psychological layer of the trap. Because when millions of people experience the same stress, and interpret it as personal failure, the system becomes invisible. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented behavior in late-stage systems. And here's the question that naturally follows. If the system is structured this way, if you were born into it, if opting out isn't realistic, what, if anything, can you actually do? That's where this story needs to end, not with panic, but with clarity. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. You didn't fail. You weren't careless. You didn't misunderstand the rules. You were born into a system that was already in motion, a system built long before you chose your career, before you signed your first loan, before you checked your first credit score. And once you see that, something important shifts. Because this video was never about blaming an empire or predicting some dramatic collapse tomorrow. It was about recognizing a pattern that repeats whenever power is managed through debt instead of production, through leverage instead of trust. Britain didn't fall because its people were lazy. Spain didn't collapse because its citizens didn't work hard enough. The Soviet Union didn't implode because individuals made bad choices. They failed because they reached a stage where the system demanded more than the society beneath it could sustainably provide. And right now, in 2024, 2025, you're living inside a similar phase, not at the end, but far enough along that pretending everything is fine no longer makes sense. Here's the mental shift that matters. Move from, the system knows best, I just need to try harder, to, the system is designed to prioritize certain outcomes, and I need to protect my family within that reality. Move from, it's my fault I'm struggling, to, I'm responding rationally to a high-pressure structure that rewards leverage, not stability. This doesn't mean panic. It doesn't mean radical decisions. And it definitely doesn't mean giving up. It means awareness. Because seeing the trap doesn't free you overnight, but it stops the trap from owning your identity. You stop measuring your worth by a score. You stop mistaking pressure for failure. You start asking better questions about risk, about dependency, about what actually matters. And that's the quiet beginning of independence. If this video helped you see the pattern more clearly, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with one person you care about, someone who's been blaming themselves for a system-level problem. And if a piece of this story clicked into place for you, leave a comment that simply says, I see it. In the next video, we'll look at the one group that consistently benefits when empires decline, and how they prepare decades ahead, while everyone else is told to stay calm. Because once you can see the pattern, the only real mistake is choosing to look away.